Hello and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Bachner. Once again, it is Howard Bachner, editor-in-chief of JAMA. And I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Murray. Chris is the director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, Seattle. And I think more than virtually any single individual in the world, he and his group have transformed the concept notion of metrics and global health. And I want to acknowledge that. In addition, I believe his work has been instrumental in crystallizing and reviving the worldwide interest in global health. Chris, it's nice to have you join me today.
Great to be here, Howard.
Interestingly enough, we're not going to be talking about some of that work, which has been published in all of the major journals, JAMA, New England Journal, Lancet, but we're going to be talking about the viewpoint that you've written entitled The Potential Future of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Will it become a recurrent seasonal disease? Chris, before we start, could you say a bit about your co-author, who is a rather prominent individual?
Yes, my co-author is Peter Piot, who is the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and of course was one of the early researchers on Ebola and head of UN AIDS and has had a very distinguished career in infectious diseases.
So, Chris, in many regards, this viewpoint is a crystal ball. It's about what's going to happen in the coming months and years. But before we get into the details of the viewpoint, are you optimistic, like many others, about the current trend in the United States and around the world? It was on the front page of the New York Times yesterday, but in the United States specifically, are you optimistic that there's some light at the end of the tunnel for the next couple months?
I think that deaths and cases and hospitalizations are most likely going to keep going down into the summer. And I think we'll have a very relatively quiet summer in terms of COVID. I think the challenge is what comes after that.
Right. Are you concerned about the emergence of these variants of concern, or do you think, at least at the moment, none has emerged that is going to threaten immunization progress in various countries?
I think that from what we know around the South African variant, depending on how you name them, B1351, using that naming scheme, that one is pretty concerning because, of course, we've seen in the Johnson & Johnson, the Novavax, and the AstraZeneca trials that the vaccines are less effective against that variant. And that, given the mutations, we probably think the same thing will be true for the P1 variant from Brazil.
Yeah.
And as those variants spread, we should expect that the vaccines will be less effective. I think the speed of spread of those variants will not be fast enough in the next 2 months to sort of reverse the trend in the spring, but will slow progress for sure.
Right. So I think there's broader and broader agreement that we will reach a reasonable nadir in the spring and perhaps into the summer. And then I think people were really hoping for a return to some semblance of normalcy in the fall, with particularly school and college return to work post-summer. But this viewpoint really focuses even beyond that. But before we get into some of the projections or the way you and Peter are thinking about it, let's talk about the concept of herd immunity, which is complicated.
It is. So herd immunity is an idea that comes from infectious disease modeling that says there's a certain level of immunity, either from past infection or from vaccination, that if you get to that threshold, there's not enough susceptible people left in the population to see sustained transmission of disease. And, there's a very simple formula in a sort of stylized world where everybody interacts with everybody else equally that says that famous R value, the number of infections caused by a single, infectious case, that you can back calculate herd immunity straight from that R value. But life's not that simple because populations aren't well mixed. We know that COVID is seasonal, so the level that will depress transmission or, quote, be herd immunity in the summer is going to be much lower than the level required to depress transmission in the winter. And it should also vary by community because people's patterns of interaction are quite different across different communities.
Now that you've discussed herd immunity, then in the viewpoint, you lay out three very important considerations that you and Peter suggest will make achieving herd immunity against COVID-19 challenging. And you articulate or discuss three different considerations. Can we walk through those one at a time, the first, the second, and the third?
Yeah. So the first consideration is the effectiveness of vaccination from all of the vaccines that are out there, but particularly the ones that we'll be using mostly in the US against the B.1.351 variant. And so the main vaccines we're using here, of course, is our Moderna and Pfizer so far. And we don't have any direct data on the effectiveness of those vaccines in human subjects against that variant. There's the New England Journal letter from the Pfizer research team that suggests reduced effectiveness against antibodies from individuals that have had 2 doses of the vaccine, but that's not the same thing as a trial. From the trials that we have observed, J&J, Novavax, and AstraZeneca in South Africa against the new variant, they had quite reduced vaccine effectiveness. So we should expect that even the more effective vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, will have reduced effectiveness against the South African variant.
Second, you talk about how effective we will be in vaccinating the population.
Absolutely. So, we know that the one good thing is there's lots of data right now about people's willingness to take the vaccine. So Facebook collects data essentially every day. There are other nationally representative surveys as well. They're all suggesting that somewhere between 70 to 75% of adults are, going to say yes or respond yes, probably to the question, will you take the vaccine if it's offered? So 3/4, let's say, of adults. That means if we don't yet have a vaccine for children, that means half of Americans getting vaccinated. If we get a vaccine that works well for children, then the question will come, what fraction of parents are going to want their kids to be vaccinated? Probably not the 3/4 that want it for themselves, but some reduced number if past history is anything to go by. So we shouldn't expect that we will get to, we should expect to get to a level 60%, 70% of Americans getting vaccinated. If you take that times the reduced efficacy against the new variants of the vaccines, then we're talking about, at best, about 50% of people becoming immune through vaccination against the new variant.
Now, I just want to go through the numbers for people. So the birth cohort is 4 million. It increases slightly between birth and 20 years. But if you assume that the child cohort and adolescent cohort is about 80 million, that at the moment is the number of people who are excluded from ACIP recommendations. And then it's 75% of 330 million minus 80 million, and then 75% of that. That's where you come up with a possibility of 50 or 60%. I just want to make sure that people can follow the broad numbers. And then there's a third challenge around herd immunity.
Yeah, and that's the one that we have the least evidence on, but it's also the one that's probably the most important for the long term. And that is this question about whether you have, being infected with one variant, let's say the variant that has been circulating up until, late fall, does that give you how much protection against, let's say, the South African variant? And particularly because of these concerns about, the mutation in the spike protein, there was evidence in the placebo arm of the Novavax trial that said that people previously infected, as measured through antibodies with COVID, had the same infection rate with the new variant as people that had not been previously infected, implying, and that's what the researchers at Novavax have said, there's no cross-variant protective immunity, at least for 351. Now, that's a big thing because we all expected a month ago that we would get to herd immunity in late summer or the fall because of the combination of vaccination plus the fact that 20% of Americans have already been infected. And that'll creep up in the weeks and months ahead. So you put those two together and you're likely to get to herd immunity. And then, we see light at the end of the tunnel. And basically, we should not get a third wave next winter. But if it turns out that there isn't cross-variant immunity, then the only way to get, to the point where we don't have a third wave next winter is through vaccination. So it's a big thing. And there's now other indirect evidence that's emerging. I think if you look at the transmission, now this is about the P1 variant in Amazonas, in Brazil, and in Peru, where they, from everything we understand, 50 or 60% have been infected with previous variants, and yet they're having a really big epidemic right now unfold, suggesting that may also be an example where we're not seeing cross-variant immunity, but in that case, that's the P1 variant.
Chris, people have said, obviously, that the variants don't stop at the border. They don't know what borders are. The virus doesn't stop at the border. Do you think there's any chance that the 351 or the P1 variant will not come to dominate in the U.S., or that is just so unlikely?
Yeah, I think it's more of a question. There's certainly a chance because we really don't understand how much the speed of the spread of 351 or P1 is. I think 117, the British variant, we've seen enough in Europe about how quickly that spread and how quickly it's now spreading in the US that at least that will come to dominate in the shorter run. And then I think the part that's really hard to know is when you have a sort of head-to-head competition between 117 and 351, what's going to happen? The only place we've observed this is in Belgium. And so far, 117 is spreading more than 351, where the two showed up about the same time. But here's the thing, is that if the cross-variant immunity turns out to not be strong, then what probably will happen is people will get 117, or some people will, and that'll be the dominant variant, and then it'll be replaced by 351 because you'll be able to get both.
Right.
And so in the long run, I think we and many others expect these variants to take over.
Now, the good news is I spoke to Rochelle Walensky last week, and we've had 3 or 4 viewpoints on the variants by Tony, Peter Offit, Adam Loring, and then Rochelle. And I was pleased to see that the Biden administration announced at least a $200 million down payment on doing more sequencing in the U.S., which is an area in which we've really lagged behind, particularly the United Kingdom.
We've lagged enormously behind. In fact, the sequencing that's out there right now, which is really mostly being done by academic labs and hasn't been part of a sort of systematic sampling like the UK has. And so it's challenging to know what is the prevalence of these variants right now. So it's great news that the government's going to try to do more of that. But we need to sequence around the world because, we're all focused on these 3 variants, but quite possibly there'll be other variants that come along that may be a sort of constant issue that we need to keep up with. So, one of the strategies to deal with that is got to be more sequencing.